Thank you very much, Bob. The first philosophy course I ever took with Bob when we were both a great deal younger. And if it wasn't for him, I don't think I would have continued on in philosophy, so he's a big reason that I'm here today too. Well, I'd like to begin by introducing myself in a personal way, although Bob has done some of that, because my reflections on the meaning and significance of dignity in the context of healthcare have grown out of my own journey as a person living with incurable neurological disease. As Bob mentioned, at the age of 29, I was diagnosed with MS. Since that time, I have lived with ongoing bodily disorder and increasing disability, and have gained an intimate knowledge of what it means to live with incurable illness in the context of modern scientific medicine and the prevailing values of North American culture. And my reflections have been further deepened by the recent experience of sharing the last 6 months of my husband's life after he was diagnosed with cancer. So I'll begin by considering how prevailing cultural attitudes shape the experience of loss of dignity, and then suggest that the values and practices of authentic Christian community provide a healing context that necessarily enhances dignity. Considerations of human dignity figure prominently in discussions of healthcare and in the debate with regard to end-of-life care. As a person living with MS, I have a particular interest in the debate concerning dignity and end-of-life decision-making. Statistics with regard to assisted suicide in Oregon show that every year patients suffering from neurological disease, ALS, are among those who committed suicide. Moreover, several of those who killed themselves under the direction of Jack Kevorkian suffered from multiple sclerosis. Having experienced what it means to live with serious neurological dysfunction and disability, I feel a certain uncomfortable kinship with these patients. I know how difficult it can be to retain a sense of personal dignity in light of prevailing cultural attitudes with respect to independence, physical integrity, suffering, and mortality, and the almost magical confidence we have in the curative power of medicine. While there may be philosophical debate about the meaning of the term dignity, in everyday life, the notion of dignity is equated with self-worth. To be treated with dignity is to be treated with respect, to be considered worthy of the regard of others. To lose one's dignity is to feel that one's value as a person is irreparably diminished. One of the most powerful barriers to retaining a sense of dignity in illness is the cultural perspective on autonomy, an ideal that de-emphasizes relationship and that stresses self-reliance, personal preference, and self-determination. Since self-reliance implies a robust, independent individual capable of acting without help, there is a strong cultural message that we should be able to stand on our own 2 feet and look after ourselves. Dependence on others is perceived as weakness. Connected to this notion of autonomy is the sense that each person should be able to do their own thing without a sense of limits. Consequently, when we have to ask for help, we feel ashamed and presume we are a burden on others. Given this view of autonomy, society places inordinate value on independence and self-determination. Thus, the act of giving, of serving another, is often negatively equated with self-denial. Full-time caregiving is deemed less valuable than pursuing activities that will bring individual fulfillment, a fulfillment that is almost exclusively measured in terms of professional and economic markers that signify success according to societal values. In light of these attitudes, there is a widespread assumption that caregiving is a one-way street, that the sick person, the recipient of care, has nothing to offer, and that the caregiver is the only one who gives. When caregiving is conceived in these terms, this inevitably arouses feelings of resentment on the part of the caregiver and incalculable feelings of guilt and self-recrimination on the part of the person receiving care. Thus, in our culture, those with debilitating illness sense they expect too much of others. Elderly parents constantly worry that they will end up being a burden to their children, who have their own lives to live, and there is a widespread presumption that those with disabilities are a drain on the lives of their able-bodied partners. In this cultural climate, it is perhaps not surprising that the fear of being a burden to others is cited as a rationale for requesting physician-assisted suicide. Indeed, so ingrained are these societal attitudes that the incurably ill may unwittingly feel that by killing themselves they are acting unselfishly in the best interests of others, and furthermore that they are in some sense obligated to do so. In the year 2000, 63% of those whose suicides were reported under the Oregon Death with Dignity Act said that they feared becoming burdens on their families, friends, and caregivers. Over the years, this concern has continued to be a factor in the decision to request physician-assisted suicide. In discussing, and several of those who committed suicide under the direction of Jack Kevorkian also felt the same way. In discussing the suicide of Janet Atkins, the first person to kill herself under the direction of Jack Kevorkian, Richard Zahner notes, it was not for her own sake, pain, abandonment, threatening to flag her resolve to be brave and such, but for the sake of her husband, children, friends. She simply could not put them through all that. Janet Atkins, you may recall, was a 54-year-old woman who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She killed herself while in the very earliest stages of her disease prior to the onset of significant symptoms. Zahner sympathizes. I don't want my wife, son, daughter, or close friends to have to go through having to care for me, even though I would not hesitate to do that for one I love. Yet, Zahner adds reflectively, who am I to say don't care for me that way? Is this not the epitome of selfishness? Since 1999, scores of foreigners, some of whom were not terminally ill, have travelled to Switzerland to kill themselves in clinics run by assisted suicide groups, such as one called Dignitas, a practice now known as suicide tourism. A close friend of my sister-in-law in England was one of these people. She had recently been diagnosed with an incurable neurological disease, but had no discernible symptoms that alerted close friends to her illness. She travelled alone to Switzerland and left letters notifying friends of her death. In 2009, Dignitas charged $9,200 for its services. A report on the deaths in these clinics notes that some who died were, quote, healthy except for a disability or severe mental disorder. As a Swiss official noted, people are only here for one day before they die. We know nothing about them, and we can't say they had a long-term desire to end their lives. The Swiss government has just rejected calls to ban these groups. An important barrier to retaining dignity in illness is the cultural emphasis on doing as opposed to being. A person's worth is judged according to his or her capacity to produce, to be useful, or his ability to achieve a certain professional status. When we say to our children, you can be anything you want to be, what we mean is that you can achieve worth through doing. I was once speaking at a conference and a minister stood up and said that they really recognized this in their church when they asked the young children to come up the front and they said to them, why does God love you? And one little 7-year-old put up his hand and said, God loves me because I'm going to be a doctor. Consequently, when activities are curtailed and roles inevitably change, there is a profound loss of self-esteem. Given this cultural attitude, a person who is unable to do not only feels diminished by the inability to engage in projects that are deemed meaningful according to societal markers of success, but he or she also feels no longer able to contribute anything of worth to others. Recognizing the difference between being and doing can be an important step in preserving personal integrity. As a woman with Parkinson's disease told me, I always imagined that when I became a grandmother, I would do a lot with my grandchildren. Then I got Parkinson's. However, she added, now I realize I can be for my grandchildren. This was a very empowering realization for her. Of course, the attitude of others is also a determining factor in enhancing the ability to retain dignity in the face of increasing debility. If by your actions you demonstrate that I am worthy of regard, no matter what the circumstances, then you affirm me in a powerful manner. Cultural attitudes with respect to health also make it hard to accept the limitations of illness. In our society, we equate health with the complete absence of disease and freedom from any physical or mental limitation. Consequently, we spend inordinate amounts of money, time, and effort in the pursuit of an illusory state of perfect physical wholeness, a state that is valued not so much as a means, but as an end in itself. While it is obviously beneficial to maintain an optimal level of physical fitness and where possible to avoid illness, the cultural perspective on health makes it difficult for people to accept the reality that sickness, aging, and death are unavoidable aspects of being human. Furthermore, in light of the undeniable successes of modern medicine, we live with the unrealistic expectation that medicine will invariably effect a cure and restore us to health. I remember well my own sense of utter shock and helplessness on learning I had an incurable disease. In this context, incurable illness is an affront, an unnatural and unacceptable state of brokenness, a view that increases the patient's experience of loss of integrity. In light of such confidence in medical intervention, many have come to view death as a failure of medical science rather than accepting it as a natural part of life. This view of death causes people to withdraw from the incurably ill. Thus, social isolation is a major source of suffering in incurable illness. The advances of medical technology have made us vulnerable in another respect. In a culture that views death as a failure of medical science, there is an enormous pressure to seek to prevent death at any cost. Consequently, as patients, we find ourselves terrified not only by medicine's impotence to cure our disease, but in light of medicine's power to keep us alive. This fear is at least one of the factors that fuels the debate on legalizing physician-assisted suicide. As paradoxical as it may seem, the option of assisted suicide can provide some sense of control over a desperately threatening future. There is one type of loss of control that has particular significance. For many, the loss of bowel and bladder control represents the most grievous experience of loss of dignity. Not only does one feel oneself reduced to the status of an infant, with the accompanying sense that as an adult one really ought to be able to exercise control, but there is the ever-present threat of public humiliation. This threat of humiliation can be overwhelming in light of cultural attitudes that treat such disorders with contempt. So harrowing is the possibility of public disgrace that many patients withdraw from social interaction. Some decide to end their lives on the grounds that incontinence robs them of all personal dignity. Indeed, 57% of those who committed assisted suicide in Oregon cited losing control of bodily functions as a reason for ending their lives. In taking care of my husband at the end of his life, I was most grateful that I had lived with MS for over 30 years. I know what it is like to live with a body that does not work, with progressive weakness and limitation, with boundaries and givens in my life. I understand the powerful feelings of degradation that accompany the loss of bodily control. Thus, I was able to help Dee recognize that his body's failings were a purely mechanical problem for which he was not personally responsible. This enabled him to retain a sense of dignity and even humor in the most trying circumstances. It is vital that caregivers demonstrate by their actions and responses that they are not repulsed by the loss of bodily control. If you can demonstrate to me that my illness does not degrade my worth as a person, then you affirm me in a powerful manner. And I thought of what Stephen Post shared yesterday, his example of Cicely Saunders, and the first hour that she spent at the hospice every day was changing bedpans. She was affirming the people in the hospice. All discussions about loss of dignity must take into account cultural attitudes that make it extraordinarily difficult for people with disabilities to retain a sense of self-worth. We place inordinate value on appearance, promoting unrealistic ideals of beauty and physical fitness that inevitably devalue those who do not meet these ideals. These negative cultural attitudes are difficult to ignore. Each time I have had to adopt a new way of getting around, first a cane, then crutches, then a walker, then a wheelchair, I have felt shame. I remember when I first had to use my motorized scooter that I was afraid that the students would think less of me if I was in a wheelchair. So for a whole semester, I would ride the scooter from my office to the classroom, park it outside the classroom, and then stagger into the room, hoping to hit the podium before I lost my balance. This was ridiculous, of course, but it was my sense of the loss of self-esteem. Until one day, one of my students, who was an older student, told me, she said, "The students in your class are in awe of you." So I was quite happy to hear about that. And then she said, "They can't believe that you can reverse your scooter so fast into the classroom without hitting the podium." In the eyes of the able-bodied, there is the clear assumption that disability is incompatible with living a meaningful life. When strangers observe I am in a wheelchair, they make the immediate judgment that my situation is an essentially negative one, that I am unable to engage in professional activities, and that I am wholly dependent on others. On many occasions, strangers have said to me, "Aren't you lucky to have your husband?" This was not so much a comment about my husband's character as it was a perception that my relationship with him was purely one of burdensome dependence. Also, people overtly treat me as dependent. When I'm in a manual wheelchair, they address questions to my companion and refer to me in the third person. Where would she like to sit? This inevitably occurs when I travel through airports. When we wheel up to the security barrier, the person at the barrier turns to my companion and says, "Can she walk at all?" My husband developed a standard response. He said, "No, but she can talk." This common response to disability is not limited to those of us who use wheelchairs. In speaking of his experience of blindness, John Hull records that people talk about him as if he is not there. "Will you put John in the back of the car with you?" "No, I'll put him in the front with me." Such attitudes also exist in the clinical context. In a national survey, women with severe disabilities reported that doctors addressed questions to their companions rather than speaking to them directly. "Is she experiencing any pain? You need to take her down to the lab for a blood test." Such common responses reinforce the individual's perception that disability reduces personal and social worth. Carol Gill, a power wheelchair user due to polio, is a clinical psychologist who has researched what it means to live with a disability. She notes that in a society that often believes people are better off dead than disabled, the available research on suicide and disability paints a disturbing picture. She says it boils down to the concept of burden. We are made to feel like burdens physically, emotionally, and that's an untenable self-view. You can't keep thinking of yourself as a burden and thrive. If one is to afford respect to those with disabilities, one must look beyond the stereotype to the person. If you focus only on my disability, then you essentially make me invisible. In attending to the person and not the disability, others indicate that physical or mental limitation does not denigrate personal worth. In reflecting on loss of dignity, we must, of course, consider disorders such as Alzheimer's and other dementias that seem to strike directly at the heart of who one is. The idea of losing my mind, losing what I am, says Richard Zehner, is as terrifying as it is awesome. For what is ultimately threatened is my very own sense of self, not only my what, but my who. Zehner quotes Robert Terry, a physician specializing in caring for those with Alzheimer's, who says that the real affliction of the disease is that it strips away your very humanity, your intellect, your personality. While Zehner does not agree with Terry's assumption that dementia strips individuals of their humanity, it must be stressed that in contemporary society many people do think in these terms. There is a widespread assumption that such patients are no longer fully persons, that in light of such affliction one has already lost the person one once loved. So convinced are people that mental disorder will rob them of all humanity in their own eyes and in the eyes of others, that they consider physician-assisted suicide to be the only viable alternative. Yet, Zehner asks, is human dignity and moral worth really tied to nothing but the full rational moral agency many people think is the very base of ethics, autonomy? I would now like to shift the discussion from considering the way in which prevailing cultural attitudes contribute to the loss of dignity to consider how the values and practices of intentional Christian community provide an alternative culture and perspective that transforms the meaning of illness. My reflections are drawn from my 12-year experience of living in a non-denominational Christian community here in Waco. Our community has found its spiritual roots in the 500-year-old nonviolent Anabaptist tradition, a tradition that produced the peace-loving Amish and Mennonites. This is a tradition that has best served our values and goals and that continues to guide our way of life. Of course, I recognize our lived community is unique in some respects, but my intent is to show how the countercultural core values of intentional Christian community, values that are foundational to the Judeo-Christian ethic, consistently enhance dignity even in the face of debilitating illness and death. The foundation stone that holds our 900-member community together is the foundation stone of self-sacrificial love. This foundation stone is, of course, a love that has been exemplified for us in the life and death of Jesus, and that finds its fullest expression in the context of a body of believers, all of whom share a commitment to seeking to exemplify this kind of love in their own individual lives. Since members of our community come from a wide variety of different cultural, social, economic, educational, and ethnic backgrounds, the glue that binds us together and that empowers us to live in deep covenantal relationships with one another is our shared commitment to this ethic of caring that transcends our individual desires and differences, and that is best conveyed in the commandment, "Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends." Since selfless love is the cardinal value, caregiving, care of and for another, is not considered a negative form of self-sacrifice, but rather it is the foundation of Christian community. This foundational ethic turns the cultural perspective on individualism versus relationship upside down. Rather than pursuing the goal of radical autonomy, we are called to live out our lives in relationship with God and with one another. Since we are committed to setting aside selfish ambition, envy, and worldly success in favor of love, humility, and service to others, our lives in community are built upon a foundation of trust that enables us to share our vulnerabilities and needs without fear of condemnation from others. As a result, the vulnerability that accompanies the reductions of illness is less a purely negative life circumstance than it is an opportunity to share in the miracle of relationship. This shift in focus from self to other transforms the cultural meanings of dependence and independence. In serving one another on a daily basis, we experience the undeniable fact that caregiving is a form of communion, of sharing with one another, in which all participants both give and receive, and that binds us together in ever-deepening relationships of love. Rather than viewing ourselves as either dependent or independent, we affirm and celebrate our mutual interdependence. When my husband was diagnosed with advanced oral cancer, he chose not to pursue aggressive radiation and chemotherapy, but rather to live out the remainder of his life at home. For several months, I was able to take care of his personal needs myself. When Dee became too weak for me to manage alone, 15 ladies in our community volunteered to work around-the-clock shifts to help me provide him with 24-hour care for for the last 3 months of his life. Some were individuals whom we did not know intimately at the beginning of our time together. However, in sharing our mutual difficulties, joys, triumphs over the weeks, we formed bonds of love that will never be broken. The overarching context of Christian community life gives all members of the community the opportunity to live out an ethic of selfless love in very concrete ways. As just one example, let me describe the care of Robert, a 49-year-old father of 5 who died from a brain tumor. During the last months of his life, friends in the community prepared meals every day for his family, and when they delivered the food, they took their families with them so that both families could eat and spend time together. Some took his children to music lessons, dentist appointments, and to play with friends, and assisted his wife with homeschooling and grocery shopping. Others took 2-hour shifts to provide him with round-the-clock care and to permit his family to attend church meetings and other events. 3 close friends attended to his personal needs. Others participated in a prayer chain from midnight to 6 a.m. 7 days a week to supplement the church's existing prayer chain for the sick. Also, as a token of love and respect, several tithed monetary offerings to cover the surviving family's financial needs. Such acts of service not only benefit the one who is sick. Throughout his illness and dying, Robert continued to minister not only to those who came under his pastoral care, but to his caregivers and to all who came into contact with him. Indeed, dozens of young people in our community have testified that Robert's experience of grace and fortitude throughout these most difficult of circumstances has been a major influence for good in their lives. In focusing on the centrality and importance of relationship, we order our daily lives in community in such a way that it is natural for people of all ages to closely associate with one another on a daily basis, whether it be older people in the community, teaching youngsters in our craft workshops, working together on the community farm, celebrating in our home churches or community-wide worship services, or simply enjoying a time of shared fellowship. Given these deep relational bonds, it is only natural to come together to serve those who have a special need. Recently, an elderly lady in our community died of cancer. Since she could not sleep at night, many young people volunteered to go regularly to her house and sing for her through the night and into the early hours of the morning. These young people have shared that their lives were profoundly changed by this experience. Even the youngest of our children enthusiastically join in to offer their gifts of love and care. When my husband was dying, countless small children visited, drew him pictures, and brought gifts they had made with their own hands. When he died, one little 8-year-old girl told her mother, "Oh, I wish Dee hadn't died. I had a lot more things I wanted to give him." Such close-knit intergenerational relationships also remind us on a daily basis that there are natural seasons and rhythms of life: birth, youth, aging, death, giving us a full appreciation that each season has its own intrinsic worth. This recognition does much to counter prevailing societal attitudes that promote unrealistic ideals about independence, physical strength, health, youth, and beauty, attitudes that inevitably devalue the elderly and the vulnerable. In caring for one another and facing together the joys and challenges of daily living, we also see clearly that disease, suffering, and death are integral aspects of our humanity. Consequently, the incurably ill and dying are not separated from the community of the living, but rather remain at the center of a web of intimate and supportive relationships that continue to affirm the value of their existence. A central tenet of Christianity is that all human beings have intrinsic worth, regardless of any contingent circumstances. Since personal worth is independent of worldly criteria, it is not related to material success, physical or mental condition, or to the individual's ability to produce. This shift in focus from extrinsic to intrinsic worth turns the cultural perspective on the importance of doing versus being upside down. The emphasis is not so much how do I define myself by my role, but how do I live out whatever role God has provided for me? What kind of a person am I? Believers are called to be imitators of Christ. Christian virtues have to do with character. In stressing that the most important question is, what kind of a person am I? We affirm that qualities of character, such as compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, and courage, relate to a way of being in the world that is not dependent upon physical attributes or abilities, and that does not look to the world's criteria of success. This means, among other things, that it is possible to retain personal integrity in spite of the onslaught and ravages of illness. When I think of the value of being, I think of the many elderly and terminally ill patients I have known who towards the end of their lives were unable to do anything, but who by their strength of character had a powerful impact on the lives of others. As just one example, I remember Perry, a young father of 4 who died from Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 35. Steadfast in faith, intelligent, thoughtful, funny, and full of joy, he was a loving father and husband who instilled lifelong values in his children. His struggles and victories in adversity encouraged others to persevere in their trials. Emaciated with ALS and strapped into his power wheelchair, Perry did not meet the worldly ideal of physical beauty and strength. One day, a saleswoman eyeing his physical condition said to his wife, "I can't believe you stuck with him." In judging Perry's worth solely on the basis of outward appearance, this woman completely missed his inner fortitude and integrity of character. Recognizing the value of being versus doing reminds us that the caregiver is not the only one who gives, and the care receiver is not the only one who receives, even though the offerings of each may be tangibly different. This recognition of the reciprocal nature of caregiving can transform our attitudes towards the giving and receiving of care. As Christians, we are also reminded that cultural attitudes stressing personal control and the postponement of death are in fact illusions. In recognizing that man is but a breath, his days are like a fleeting shadow, we comprehend the undeniable fact that there are certain givens in our lives. We live always with the fragility of mortality. It is often hard for us to relinquish control in all areas of our life, especially as these relate to our perception of what it means to be, say, a wife, a mother, a professional, a breadwinner. When a dear friend became debilitated with cancer, she found it particularly hard to give up full responsibility for taking care of her own home. Yet she found that the act of relinquishing control in that area of her life, of submitting to her vulnerability and need, gave her the opportunity to experience depths of affection and thanksgiving that she had never felt before. If those of us who need help can come to recognize that our need is an opportunity to experience deep and meaningful relationships with others, rather than a burdensome obligation we thrust upon them, we can avoid the self-recrimination and guilt that poisons the gift of love, and if we are not willing to receive, we prevent someone from giving. Even severe mental affliction cannot totally negate personal worth. Those who are afflicted with dementias are unique human beings, mother, grandmother, brother, husband, who remain inherently worthy of respect. As David Smith notes, although we should not treat demented persons as if they were not demented, we also should not pretend that they are no longer part of our family or community. The values and practices that are the foundation for Christian community life provide a context in which the commitment to provide for the needs of such patients is a given. As Christians, we believe that such patients are human beings created in the image of God, who are caught in the throes of a terrible and difficult affliction and who need all the love and care that we ourselves would want. Furthermore, since we respond to these needs as a community, many people are available to share in the complex provision of care. We have found that this atmosphere of love and care provides a healing context that permits such patients to receive and even give love despite their loss of faculties. In responding to the reductions of illness in a positive way, our community enacts its Christian beliefs and expresses its solidarity with the sufferer. When any member suffers, it is an opportunity for the community to join together as one, to embrace the individual and provide a loving, caring environment that enables him or her to withstand and overcome the physical, emotional, spiritual, and existential crisis. It is a time for demonstrating by our actions that we affirm the values that characterize our beliefs as Christians, and particularly the central truth that the power of love overcomes even the power of death. In acknowledging and responding to the agony of personal suffering, the community exercises compassion, suffering with. In thinking about compassion, I want to emphasize that although there is a sense in which suffering is personal, there is also a sense in which suffering can be shared. And when suffering is shared, the pain and distress is easier to bear. Let me give an example from my own experience. On the day that Dee was diagnosed with cancer, I wrote in my journal, "We are in the Garden of Gethsemane." In recalling the travail of Gethsemane, I thought of the disciples. While Jesus suffered in agony, they slept. One gospel account says they were exhausted with sorrow. And I shared with a friend that my greatest fear was that I would abandon Dee, that I would not have the fortitude to witness his pain and the courage to stand with him in his suffering. My friend said, "We will stand with you." Knowing that I did not face this trial alone enabled me to be present with Dee, to stare death in the face and remain intact. From the moment of diagnosis, we were continually uplifted and held in the embrace of the loving community. In the meals that were prepared, in the prayers that were said, in the cards that were written, in the agonized telephone calls that were returned in the middle of the night, in the hands that washed Dee's body, in the tears we shared together, and in the gatherings around the bedside. We really could say, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." I can attest to the truth of the song, "Love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else would help. Love lifted me." In reflecting on the Garden of Gethsemane, I am also reminded that, as Michael Main writes, the crucified Christ is the ultimate symbol of dislocation and shared vulnerability. Christianity does not turn its face away from the agony of personal suffering. Central to its message is the reality of the cross. As Christians, we serve a God who endured the experience of suffering, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We believe our human suffering is not unnoticed, nor dismissed as meaningless, nor does God withdraw from us. The God of love is Emmanuel, which means God with us. We are therefore comforted in knowing that we are not alone in our suffering. The reality of the cross is at odds with the cultural understanding of autonomy. In imitating Christ, believers are called to relinquish absolute control over their lives. Jesus' admonition is to pick up your cross and follow me every single day. Along the way, we may well have to face the burdens of illness, suffering, and disability, and inevitably we will experience the reductions of aging and death. These reductions do not diminish one's worth as a human being. Furthermore, if I am to stay true to the example of Jesus in Gethsemane, who in his agony prayed until his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, asking, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me," but who ended his prayer with the words, "Not my will, but thine be done," I cannot arbitrarily circumscribe the limits of the cross I am willing to bear. The desire to limit the cross is motivated by the wish to escape a worst-case scenario that seems personally unendurable. Yet as Christians, we have found that one can and does experience supernatural grace even in these direst of circumstances. I have witnessed this supernatural grace many times in our community life. We have seen several dear friends face terminal illness, and without exception, all have found extraordinary grace and peace that carried them through to the end of their lives. I have also witnessed this overcoming power in my own illness and in Dee's dying months, in the power of prayer to relieve pain and physical symptoms, in the power of love to bring comfort, in the power of God's presence to bring grace and peace in the midst of chaos. Before Dee and I faced his death, I had never really understood the purpose of suffering. But in our experience of suffering, I saw how the incredible love that Dee and I shared for one another throughout our marriage was distilled and purified. As our boundaries constricted more and more, and the reductions of illness became greater and greater, our love became stronger and stronger, until in the end there was nothing left but our love for one another, the love we felt from those around us, and the love we felt from God. One day, when Dee battled severe physical distress, I said to him, "I'm sorry you have to go through this." He responded, "This is a healing experience for me." The grounding for this healing experience was the supernatural love that encompassed us as that love was expressed through the self-sacrificial service of others. The lesson from the Garden of Gethsemane is that suffering, no matter how intractable, can be redeemed. As Christians, we believe that the cross is not the end of the story in God's eternal purposes. Our faith calls us to look beyond the present suffering to a future glory that will be revealed to us if we are willing to stay the course. It also assures us that nothing, tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril or sword, nor death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, shall be able to separate us from the love of God. We are encouraged, therefore, to persevere in the face of trials, trusting in God and knowing that beyond the agony of Calvary lies the promise of the empty tomb. This promise is no illusion. We have a cloud of witnesses who have gone before us and testified to its truth. From an immanent perspective, perseverance in the face of suffering is meaningless. From an eternal perspective, there is a larger wisdom that places disease, suffering, and death within the context of a cosmic narrative of the power of love overcoming even the power of death. Indeed, in this context, the reductions of debilitating illness and the willingness to surrender to our personal vulnerability is the avenue that opens us up to the miracle of relationship, a miracle that brings tears of gratitude and thanksgiving even in the most difficult circumstances, and that affirms the value of our humanity. In closing, in reflecting on my own experience, both in the wider culture and in the context of Christian community, I am struck by the extent to which cultural values shape the meaning and experience of debilitating illness. In a culture in which radical autonomy is celebrated as the cardinal value, the loss of independence that occurs with debilitating illness inevitably strikes at the heart of one's sense of personal integrity and self-worth. Authentic Christian community offers an alternative culture with a radically different set of values. In deliberately rejecting the cultural perspective on autonomy and self-determination in favor of the ethic of self-sacrificial love, we affirm the centrality of service, servanthood, of relationship versus independence, of interdependence versus isolation, of being versus doing, of character versus circumstance, and of the intrinsic worth of every human being. In this context, we deliberately reject the notion that caring or being cared for is a burden, and that the vulnerability of illness necessarily robs one of value and meaning. Rather, the task of caregiving is an opportunity to honor and serve one another as an expression of the love of God, and illness is an opportunity to experience the miracle of relationship. This ethic of love and care affords dignity to all. Thank you very much.
Well, this is such a moving presentation. from Kay, that it's kind of difficult, it seems to me, to move into questions and analysis. But we do have time for that. And so we have microphones on both sides of the room. And if you have a question, we would appreciate you coming and addressing the question to Kay in a way that we can all hear it. So please use the microphone. Somebody come forward with a question.
Very profound and moving presentation. You made a comment very early on, it might be tangential, but it provoked a thought. You talked about when your husband was losing control of his bladder, that what affirmed his dignity was realizing that those were just mechanics, that was not him. And in recent philosophical and theological anthropology, there's kind of a move towards physicalism, materialism, kind of the notion that we are embodied and that's intrinsic to who we are as a reaction against Cartesian dualism. But yet your comment seemed to suggest that perhaps a dualistic anthropology might help us affirm our dignity by realizing this machine, crassly, is not who we are. Comment on that?
Well, I definitely don't want to affirm a dualistic notion because I'm a phenomenologist. So I think of us as, obviously we are embodied, but obviously this embodiment that is a part of us has a physical dimension, has a physical nature, much of which is beyond my control. And so I think that in affirming that the body is a physical mechanism, that there are things that go on in the body that are purely mechanical, that it's not a dualistic notion. It's that we are embodied human beings, but as a part of that embodiment has a material nature. So, but I certainly don't want to split body from person, because it's impossible to do, because we are embodied. But I think it is very helpful to recognize that there are physical things that go on in the body that are not demeaning to who I am. Because part of the problem, with some of the attitudes that we have, is that we identify ourselves as being this material thing. So, for example, there are certain standards of beauty and physical fitness, and we identify ourselves as being wholly that person, and when that is no longer available, that's a problem for us. For example, I have a friend who had MS, who was a marathon runner, and when she defined herself as being a marathon runner, and when she could no longer run marathons, this was devastating to her sense of self-worth, because she had wholly identified with that part, that physical capacity then. But I appreciate your question.
Wonderful presentation, thank you. I'd like to flesh out a little bit more the Christian community, the church, the local group that you're with. This is obviously an exceedingly healthy group functioning right now. How did that group get to this point? What historically do you sense made this group function as well as it does?
Well, there are people here who could answer this question better than I can, but I can give you a little bit of the history of the group, and I invite other people here, if they want to add something, they can. the community started in 1973 as a mission outreach in the slums of New York City. Our founding minister was a young minister. He was 29, his wife was 21. They felt the call to go to New York City, and they started this mission there. And my understanding is that as a group began to be gathered together, they found themselves being a community. They found themselves recognizing that the relationships that they were developing were very important. And they moved from, this was also not a very good place to bring up their children. They had young children. So they felt to move. They moved to New Jersey, and they felt that the context that God was calling them to was a much more of a holistic kind of a context, where church was a way of life. It wasn't just, something that you did on Sundays. It was a lived life. And so they moved to New Jersey. They started growing their own gardens and that kind of thing. And then they felt God calling them to really move into an agricultural context. The whole community moved to Colorado. And during that period of time, my understanding is that they prayed about how to be this community, how to develop these relationships, how to really be a living community where people did lay down their lives for one another, how to live out this ethic. And then the sense was that the community did not want to be isolated from the wider community, and an opportunity came for us to come to Waco, and we've been in Waco since 1990. And so the only thing I can say is, how did we get to be where we are? I think that that at every step along the way, God showed us how to be more to one another than we were, what it really means to live in community, what it means to lay down your lives for one another. And as a part of that, my first, I did not join the community till 1998. And my first impression when I went to visit the community and I saw the relationships that people had with one another, I recognized that the only way this could work, because we have people from Israel, we have people from different cultural backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, and I recognized that there were no barriers between any of these people. And what I recognized was that the only way this could work would be if everybody was committed to a transcendent ethic. And so for us, that transcendent ethic is, the relationship with God and the relationship with one another. And so when I said in my presentation, it requires a deliberate rejecting the value of radical autonomy, and a deliberate decision to live your life according to that ethic.
Thank you for your presentation. I stepped with some fear and trembling into a hopeful place, because I heard an authentic Baptist voice, and I, for one, really appreciate hearing that at this conference. So thank you for that. You have stimulated my moral imagination in two ways. One, I simply want to affirm; the other, to ask a question. I want to affirm. I work in Indiana, in a large city medical center. And in Indiana, we have many older order Amish communities who, especially when their children suffer from devastating genetic diseases, etc., come to us for assistance. they always confuse our medical staff by how they live. You've given me some insight by this presentation on how to help our medical staff deal more effectively with these communities of people. So thank you for that. You also raised the question that I've before me, that we deal not with communities of people, we are strangers dealing with strangers. We're trauma centers, we're referral centers. Most of the really difficult ethical challenges we face are actually people who are strangers from themselves, and frequently, maybe most often, strangers from their own families even. And so it's strange physicians dealing with alienated patients, and then we have a whole host of end-of-life choices, beginning-of-life choices that are really difficult. Do you have any ways that you could further my moral imagination out of that way in which the community, the medical community that I live and work in, seeks to meet these strangers and provide some sense of help to them?
Well, I recognize that the challenge outside of a community, outside of a shared community, is very grave, and that part of the problem with medical care is that strangers are taking care of strangers. The one thing that I really feel about, and I don't know that it helps in making those decisions. I don't know how you make those decisions in the context of strangers advising. You know, and we've seen some of that in this conference with, you know, so how do we think about dignity and what does that mean in the face? But I do think that it really, there has to be a shift in the way we think about caregiving, because I think if medical professionals can think about caregiving in terms of the kinds of things that I talk about, of it being a reciprocal relationship, of serving another person, of being aware somehow of their situation, of it being a service profession, that in some ways we might be able to become closer to one another, to have less of a stranger relationship. Do you understand what I mean? Now, I don't know that that's necessarily going to solve the problems that you have, because I mean, I recognize that those problems are horrendously difficult in the context of stranger relationships. So.
Thinking that I'm a committed Christian my whole life, and as I sat listening to the talk, I realized I've been neglecting a huge part of my Christian commitment. You know, and I live with a person who's 79, and it's very tempting to kind of leave him alone and make him fend for himself, because it takes so much time and effort, and busy and so forth. And I guess this is a common question, but I don't know how to help people educate ourselves and committed Christians of this enormous duty that is often missed, because everyone's so busy and everyone's so far away from each other, and thinking many people who live in a suburb rather than Houston, and they can drive anymore, and then what do they do? You know, our society is not well set up for this. It's kind of scary.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your comment, and I agree with you that our society is not set up to help us to do those things very well. But I also feel like there are ways in which we can do it in the context of that society, but I guess that it involves certain choices about how we can bring it about. But I think being very aware that this is something that we want to do, this is something that we want to change, this is something that we want to try and bring about, then we can perhaps find ways that we can do something with these crazy schedules so that we have more of an opportunity to do it. But I really appreciate your comment.
Let's do take time for one more observation or question.
Until the night, chatted 40 years. My father was a child of Down syndrome. Throughout suffering in the church, community often says good words in their care to try to get us out of our suffering. What I think I appreciate, if I say I think because this is what I think I heard, you have invited us into our suffering. You walked into and embraced your suffering. And out of that, you transformed. Some resurrection has been happening in your life and continues this. Not because of some gospel that tells you out of your suffering, but some gospel that invites you into it. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing it.
I think so, yes. I think that's what you're hearing. And I can remember a telephone conversation that I had with a dear friend right the day after I think my husband had been diagnosed with cancer. And he shared something with me, and he said to me, I know that this sounds like just words, but it's really not just words. And my inclination at that moment was to think, well, it may just be words. But what has enabled me to go through these things that I've been talking about is that other Christians, the Christian family, the community around me, demonstrated to me that it was not words, and that's why we need one another. I don't know how anybody does it alone. We need one another. We need to show others how our faith holds us up. And this, I can't exactly capture exactly how you said it. But all I can tell you from my own experience is that these experiences, the experience of my husband's death, changed me forever. And so now when the next thing comes up, I can look back and I can say, look what happened in that experience. Look what God did in that experience. Look how my brothers and sisters held me up. And they were able to hold me up because they had been through other experiences when they found out it was not just words. And so it's true. I think that what has happened is that in all of this experience, my faith has been internalized, built up in a way that it might not have been without the experience of suffering. So I appreciate your comment.
Okay, so many of us have seen your life transformed over the years, and words are very important, though, because as we listen to your words today, they can play a transformative role in our own lives. We are deeply grateful.